All right, so we are now in part two of Griffin's on human rights, and this is now we are going to be now looking at the highest level rights. So these values, these rights that are connected to these fundamental values, and then they become his set of fundamental human rights. And they are centered on the values of autonomy, liberty, and welfare. Chapter 8 will deal with autonomy, 9 liberty, and 10 all about welfare. So, chapter 8 dealing with autonomy. Human rights, remember, are like fences. They protect their guardrails, whatever metaphor you like. They protect what we regard as really valuable about ourselves. And remember, Griffin was, very much this notion of us, of human beings as normative agents. And humans as normative agents is a subset of human beings in general. Remember, he doesn't think that all human beings, in virtue of being human beings, get human rights. No, it's a certain kind of right that protects a certain part of being human, namely being a normative agent. And keep in mind that this also is Griffin saying that not everything that's morally significant is a human right. But certainly human rights would be morally significant. So the class of values, or the class of what is, sort of loosely saying that whatever is morally significant, if we collect it into a giant class, human rights are a subset of that. It's not coextensive. Remember, he keeps trying to prevent from human rights becoming coextensive or identified with all of morality, such that everything is a human right and morality is just the study of human rights. He's trying to block that. And then, as we saw earlier, he was trying to block the overinflation of human rights via sort of like the UDHR, and sort of the devaluation of human rights, as in the Rawlsian project, with like the well-ordered people's project. So he's a number of shall we say, yes, he's running a gauntlet. He's trying to figure out how to get this notion of human rights off the ground in a defensible, objective, non-ethnocentric manner. So he's working, he's fighting on a lot of fronts. Now let's look at autonomy a little bit more. And the first thing that he wants to talk about, two elements that are important. Welfare is too, but for now, autonomy is the main thing. But just splitting autonomy and liberty, because many times people will say, well, they're just part and parcel. As a matter of fact, lots of times autonomy, liberty, and welfare, they're all lumped together. And some people don't think you can really distinguish this. Griffin thinks you can, but sometimes he's not always clear. And anyways, we'll cross that when those hurdles when we come to them. So the first thing that we'll look at here is splitting and getting an idea of the difference between autonomy and liberty. And so I did this little chart here. It's basically summarizing pretty well verbatim what Griffin says in the book. If you think over here, you have the value, like, okay, autonomy and liberty. And I just talked about a contrast class. Like, there's a class that that autonomy is opposed to. So you get an idea of what the differences are between autonomy and liberty by looking at what is autonomy opposed to and what is liberty opposed to. So sometimes it's easier to see what the two values are that way. So when we talk about autonomy, we're talking when you protect your autonomy, you're protecting it against things like indoctrination, like being brainwashed, being dominated, manipulated. Like, we're talking about sort of a kind of psychological dimension, right? Where you say, I want to think freely. I don't want to be, where I'm sort of mentally coerced or corrupted, and I'm not really sure of it, and I'm not really sure I'm thinking clearly. I might be brainwashed. I might be getting manipulated. I might be educated in the sense that I'm not really being educated, but I'm being indoctrinated, right? So so you think about, being raised in such an atmosphere that you can't even think clearly. All right, so that's really, or you're raised in such a conformist group or community or society, right? That you never really had a chance to think clearly or autonomously, tons of conventions, right? So again, autonomy is like a reaction to all this, or the opposite, or these are the enemies of autonomy. All right. Now liberty is, a little more concrete, right? A little more out there in the world, right? As we tend to talk about like political liberties, right? So, this is like where where it's not so much that you're being forced, right? So, in one thing, it could be like education educates you into being a conformist, and that would be violating your autonomy. But violating your liberty is, let's say, compulsion, where like you're being physically forced into something, or constrained, or you're finding yourself in a situation where there's not many options to actually choose from. So you could actually be a free chooser, and I might say, yeah, you can go ahead and choose whatever you like, but you only have two choices, right? Um, so in that sense, I mean, we even have a fallacy that's named like a false dichotomy, where, yeah, you're free. I'll give you your freedom to choose, but you only have two choices. And where there should be, and there actually are more. So we sometimes call that a fallacy of the false dichotomy. So that is kind of a constraint on your liberty, right? So it's not probably by accident that certain forms of bad reasoning are connected, like a fallacy, with the suppression of probably a fundamental value. And so it's not surprising that critical thinking is often linked to autonomy, right? One of the things that philosophy professors like to say, and I like to say it being a philosophy professor, is that critical thinking is a way to protect your autonomy. So, being able to critically think is a way to see through lots of attempts to dominate you or manipulate you or drive you into conformity, and of course, to indoctrinate you. Okay, so think of this as sort of a little more cerebral, mental, internal, and this is a little bit more external, little bit more, compulsion, like being externally driven. And of course, that's going to be sort of on a continuum, sort of real deep inside, then moving towards the outside, and then of course, welfare is like, really your life out here in the real world. So just to get a better idea of how distinct these are, here's some examples. Suppose there are values X, Y, and Z. Let's say Joe is raised very strictly to the point where he really has no capacity to think other than enjoying and agreeing with X, Y, and Z. So he's been raised in an extremely conformist situation. So you might want to say he has no capacity to even think. So he has like autonomy, no, but he could have liberty in the sense that he's been so heavily indoctrinated that he's okay with all this, right? So Orwell worries about that in his great work 1984. Is like, you may not have to worry if I got you on this one. I could educate you so much that you're so much you conform, and you're such a conventionalist and all that I could open this up, and I'm not going to worry about it, because you're going to pick what I want you to pick. Even if I give you a ton of options, I give you X, Y, Z. I indoctrinate you so much that that's the only thing you want. I can give you all kinds of other options. You'll never pick them. So yeah, you have I could say, well, you're at liberty, but you're not really making free choices. So a guy like Joe, we would say he doesn't really have autonomy, but he may have liberty. Now, the other two cases with Sally and Buffy, we could, again, split this up a little bit more. Like, let's say Sally is raised as a free thinker, and so is Buffy, so that they both would have, they both have autonomy. Okay, but let's say so that they could reject them. But let's say Sally's in a type of society, right, that only offers X, Y, and Z. So in that sense, Sally could be raised as a free thinker, evaluate these to have her autonomy, because she might accept them, right? But let's say if she rejects them, then she's expressing her autonomy and wants to do something else, but has, I'll put a little negation sign, no liberty, right? So the negation, that's called a tilde. That means a negation. So you could have someone who has autonomy and no liberty. You could have someone who has liberty and no autonomy. And then Buffy might be, a free thinker raised where there's other options, and also has liberty. So if you could sort of think, imagine some situations, run them around in your brain to make sure you're understanding this dichotomy between autonomy and liberty. Is this a radical dichotomy? Does it really hold up under absolute scrutiny? Probably not. But it's good enough for us to talk at this level and to talk about human rights. And for instance, is there such a thing as, like, when we talk about politics and ethics, and we talk about human rights, and we talk about autonomy as being a value that we have, and we protect it. It's part of our normativity and all, being able to conceive of a well ordered and life that would be desirable to live, and et cetera, et cetera. Are we talking about autonomy that's absolutely free of all indoctrination? Are we talking about autonomy that runs so deep and so thick that it is absolutely independent of the world? Like, it's a totally free autonomy, kind of like the stuff that Kant was pushing, where the idea of the self that is so free it has no inklings and nothing that influences its ethical judgment. It's completely autonomous. That's radical freedom of the will. Do we even have that? Griffin says, I don't really know. This is at a really high and abstract level. Do we really even need to worry about this? He's not going to solve the freedom of the will problem in here. He's just talking about sort of more, again, I said it's fairly cerebral and fairly abstract, but it's not that abstract that it has to be completely free of everything. We're trying to get something that sort of within the bounds of reasoning about everyday life. And I think we can clearly distinguish between, a pretty standard education in a university, in a liberal democracy, and then between various forms of brainwashing and indoctrination. I think that's easily distinguishable, and there's a big gap between the two. So we don't have to have this radical sense. And so, Griffin is not going to dig into that great old chestnut, interesting as it might be. That is the distinction between freedom of the will and determinism, and how do they relate, and whether or not. He's not going to dig into that. And to be fair, John Stuart Mill mentions this as well in his works, and says, well, we don't have to solve that. We're just talking really on the political level, like political autonomy and political liberty. We're not doing really hardcore metaphysics. So there are, and interestingly enough, Griffin mentions this a couple times in the book, that his understanding of all of these things, the values of autonomy, liberty, and welfare, actually refer back to the great thinker of Pico della Mirandola, right? Mirandola's work, The Dignity of Man, in a Renaissance work. Griffin says, my thinking is sort of a continuation of that tradition. Okay, so we have that, we've got a basic notion of autonomy. That's a sort of a freedom, at least a political thinking of freedom, whether it's radically independent of all, material considerations, like is the mind dependent on the brain. He's not going to worry about that. And so the next thing that he wants to talk about, and I'll talk about in the next video, is to go a little bit more in the concept of what is meant by liberty. Stay tuned.